Hello, my friends, and welcome to my kitchen. It is a rainy day here on the farm, the first rainy day that we have had in months and months and months. And I thought this is the perfect time to sit down and go through a big old sourdough discussion because I get a lot of emails and a lot of comments asking questions about baking sourdough bread. And this is very exciting to me because I am a huge sourdough advocate for a few reasons that we'll talk about today. But sourdough bread making is simple and yet complicated, and it's easy. You can do it right now, and it's also something that you could study for the rest of your life. It's kind of like winemaking. It's one of those beautiful, natural, magical things that we get to do in the kitchen. And so we're going to dive into what to do when your sourdough bread is terrible. We're going to be kind of troubleshooting, and I'm going to be answering direct questions, which is why I have my laptop here. So this is going to be a little bit more of a sit-down discussion. I asked all of you in our community page here on our YouTube channel, what sourdough questions do you have for me? I want to make sure to answer them for you. So I'm literally going to be going through one by one, breaking this up, hopefully in a way that makes a lot of sense to you so that you can ultimately bake better sourdough bread.
We're stretching and expanding into new skills today with our sourdough baking, but let's not stop there. I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions of people come together to pick from thousands of inspiring classes, ranging from illustration to design to photography to fine art, film, video, and more. Skillshare is for those of us who want to continue to grow and learn, creative and curious people, whether you're a beginner or a pro. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description below the video will also get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So here's what I want you to do. Click the link, get that free trial, and check out all the incredible sourdough classes that are there on Skillshare. I'm learning to make all kinds of breads like sourdough burgers with Marcel de Bon. If you're looking to expand, learn, grow, and play, visit the link below the video to get started with Skillshare today.
So we're going to divide it up into 3 different sections: starter, leaven, and bread. So as the name suggests, everything begins with a sourdough starter. Now I've done a video on this before. I'll tag it below this video, but I'm going to walk you through it again because it certainly doesn't hurt to hear it again and again, especially if you just landed on this video and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So this is my sourdough starter, a starter that I guard with my life. This was a starter that was given to me by the founder of Jovial. Her name was Carla, and she has since passed. This is very special to me. And so, like, if my house was on fire, I would grab my children and then I would grab my sourdough starter. So I keep it in these little plastic containers. Sometimes I keep it in mason jars. It doesn't really matter what you keep it in, but you do want a nice fitting lid because the sourdough starter will dry out. Now, this may look a lot different than the sourdough starter you're used to, and it probably should. This is a dry sourdough starter. A lot of times when you think of a sourdough starter, you think of kind of a mason jar completely full, bubbling over. That's a wet sourdough starter. So the ratio of a dry sourdough starter is 1 part water to 2 parts flour. A wet starter is typically 50-50, so 50% water, 50% flour. So the ratio is going to be different. Now, this sourdough starter, Carla started over 20 years ago, but don't let that deter you. I'm going to tag a video of hers on how to start your own sourdough starter. I'll put a link to that below this video. We're not going to walk through exactly how to start a sourdough starter today, but we are going to be talking about troubleshooting once we've got one. So first thing to note is that your sourdough starter should actually smell really good. It should smell like yogurt, which is exactly what this one smells like. I had kept a wet sourdough starter for many years, and it smelled skunky, for lack of a better word. I feed my sourdough starter with just filtered water and Jovial's all-purpose Einkorn flour. Here's the thing about sourdough starter. All wheat kernels, what we grind up to make flour, have wild yeast in them and on them. And that's what we're ultimately capturing to get this sourdough starter going. A lot of times people have problems getting their sourdough starter started or keeping it healthy and vibrant as they're feeding it because they're using bleached flour. And if you used bleached flour, basically that has killed the yeast that exists on that wheat and ultimately in that flour. So if you're having problems with getting your starter nice and bubbly, if it's just not super active, make sure that you're using non-bleached flour. Okay, that's one real quick way to troubleshoot. So I'm going to show you how I feed my sourdough starter. This is the max amount of starter I have at any time. This is one of the reasons I really enjoy keeping a dry sourdough starter, because no starter goes to waste. And you don't have to feed it twice a day. In fact, I feed my starter maybe once every week, maybe once every 2 weeks. So I'll show you how I do that. Let me grab a bowl. Now I want you to hang with me here, okay? Because what I have found, and I've been teaching my cooking community now for over 3 years. I've taught a lot of people how to make bread. When I say the word grams, people's eyes cross. If I were to say the exact same thing in a measurement that made sense, so if I said a quarter cup of flour to a quarter cup of water, you're fine with that. You feel okay with it. As soon as I start saying grams, whoo, all bets are off. But hang with me, okay? This is actually going to be your best friend when it comes to making bread. I got a lot of questions, and the answer to a lot of those questions is a digital scale. We'll address those questions, so stay with me. If you do not have a digital scale, these are very inexpensive. I think they're, $20. Grab them from your kitchen store, whatever. It makes all the difference when you're feeding your sourdough starter, because you do want to make sure that you get your ratios right, okay? So whenever I put something on, I just make sure I tare it to 0. I do everything in grams, okay? So like I said, this is the max amount of starter that I have at any given time. Every time I want to make bread, I take 30 grams out. It's about a tablespoon. So let's just pretend, okay? Hang with me. This is probably really close to 30 grams. So that's 1 loaf of bread, okay? Let's say I make that loaf of bread on Monday. Then I put my lid back on, sourdough starter goes back in the fridge. Now let's say I want to make bread on Wednesday. I bring out my sourdough starter, take out 30 grams. We'll talk about the leaven next, but let's just pretend, okay? Took some out, put my lid back on, sourdough starter goes back into the fridge. Thursday, I want to make more bread. I take it out. Okay, there's Thursday's bread. Hang with me. Back in the fridge. Friday, I want to make bread. I take it out. Okay, there's Friday's. Now this is all I have left of my super important sourdough starter. It's about 20 grams. So you can see I got about 4 loaves out of that. Typically, if I were to measure, I should get about 5, about a week's worth for me. This is all I have left. So let me show you what I do. Once it gets down to 20 grams, 10 grams, you just have to have a little bit. Just don't ever use this last bit, okay? Because this is your culture. This is what's going to keep your sourdough starter going. So let me get warm water. I should have grabbed that. Pretend that none of this exists, okay? We've made bread with that. We've got our 20 grams left. So at the end of the week, it's time to feed my sourdough starter. Mind you, this is the first time I'm going to be feeding it all week, okay? To my 20 grams, I do 1 part water. In this case, that's 50 grams. And I got asked this question. I want to make sure we get to every question, so I don't want to confuse myself, but they said it's really hard and stiff, and don't you have to mix it into the water? Yeah, it's, you can kind of see the texture of this dough. So I'm just kind of scraping the sides, trying to mix it as well into the water as I can. It's not going to be perfect, but you can see the water has changed color. And that tells me that that culture is getting nice and mixed in. Okay, 1 part water, 2 parts flour. So we're going to go for 100 grams of flour. Close, close, close. Okay. You can see I'm just using a fork. It's not a big thing. A lot of times we just make sourdough so complicated. And in many ways it is an art form. I mean, you could literally spend your life perfecting it, but that doesn't make it complicated. It just means you can always, it's one of those things you can kind of always get better at, always improve upon. And it's fun. People like to challenge themselves. It's like playing a musical instrument or learning a language or learning to cook something. Okay, so I'm trying to make this as clear as I can because I know that it can be a little difficult. I had my 20 grams of leftover starter after baking all week. To that, I added 50 grams of water. And then to that, I zeroed out my scale again and added 100 grams of flour. Okay, and that's my ratio. 2 parts flour to 1 part water. Now this is my starter. And she's all fed and happy. Usually when I feed my starter, I like to put her into a nice clean container. You don't have to, you could put it right back in here. I just feel better starting the week. I don't know, it makes me feel nice, so I do it. And then one important thing that I always do with my starter is I touch it. Every time I feed it, I touch it because there's this interesting thing that happens when you bake with sourdough a lot. You bake with your starter, wild yeasts begin to colonize your kitchen. So my kitchen is full of beautiful wild yeasts from this very starter. And so the result of that is I have a more active bread because my kitchen is quite literally populated with it from me doing it all the time. And so you might notice that if you're brand new to this, your bread's just going to be a little bit slower than sometimes what you see in a recipe or what you see online. And that's simply because you're in the process of colonizing your kitchen with these beautiful wild yeasts. These wild yeasts exist in the air, they exist on the surfaces, they exist on my hands. And I like to make myself known to my starter. I think they genuinely do respond different to the baker that's baking with them. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but there you have it. Okay, so this is mixed. You can see it's kind of tacky. That goes right back into my container. Lid goes on. Okay, now I'm going to leave this out at room temperature. Your starter does best anywhere between 70 and 80 degrees. So if your kitchen's cold, this is going to take a lot longer. If it's really hot, it's going to take a lot less time. And so at this temperature, about 73 in here, I can just leave this out for about 12 hours. After that 12-hour period, it's going to look just like it did when I opened it up for you the first time. And once it started to bubble and activate, boom, it goes right back in the refrigerator. And the whole process continues again. So when I want to make bread the next Monday, I grab it out, pull my piece out, and so on it goes. And this goes on forever. There are people that have been baking with the same sourdough starter for generations. So long as you always keep a little bit of starter, you can get it going again, and you can always have something to bake from. Now I want to dive into the questions because some of them directly affected the starter. And so let me make sure I address that before we move on to the leaven. So I was asked, is there a way to have a starter without having to feed it daily? Yes, there is, and this is the way to do it. Your dry sourdough starter, you do not have to feed it daily. You just feed it, however, you feed it basically every 5 loaves. So if you take 2 weeks to bake 5 loaves, then you feed it once every 2 weeks. If you bake 5 loaves a month, then you feed it once a month. So just based on how much you pull out, easy way to not have to feed it daily. Okay, next question. I know you have a drier sourdough starter than I have. Can you give the recipes or instructions on how to make your starter and how you feed it? That's just what we walked through. I did get this question a lot. If I have a wet starter, can I convert it to a dry sourdough starter? Yeah, you can. All you need to do is take 20 grams from your starter that you have now and feed it at the 2-to-1 ratio. So take 20 grams, put it in a container, add 50 grams water, 100 grams flour. I would do a few feedings just to acclimate your starter to the drier ratio, but you can easily convert the starter that you have now to this dry starter method. In terms of actually beginning a sourdough starter from the ground up, I'm going to link to Carla from Jovial's video because she does such a good job of explaining it. I will post that right below this video if you do not have a sourdough starter going yet and you'd like to get one started. All right, here's another question. I have a dry sourdough starter that I keep in the refrigerator. When I want to bake bread, do I take it out and refresh the starter first? No, you do not. You just take it out, take your piece out, and then we're going to move on to the leaven, which we'll talk about next. That's the next big portion. but your sourdough starter does not need to be refreshed before you bake bread. Okay, another question that we got asked was, my sourdough starter seems really dry. So they were following the dry starter method, but it gets a little bit of crumbly. That should not be okay. I would say check your scale, make sure that you're tearing it out, which means zeroing it out between adding your flour and adding your water, because it should really be the consistency of a nice bread dough. And so if it's not, you're going to need to add a little bit more water. So I would check your scale. Okay, Becky asked, what do I do if I feed my starter morning and night for 3 weeks straight and it still doesn't do a good job? I would say make sure that you're not using a bleached flour, and make sure that you're not interacting with any kind of chemicals or any kind of soaps. Sometimes if people are washing their hands, let's say with an antibacterial soap, they don't wash it off well, then they handle their starter. Stuff like that can impact it, because this is a bacteria and yeast colony and it needs to be alive. So too sterile of an environment is not a good place for your sourdough starter. You can also just try again. So sometimes, depending on what flour you use, like I said, if it's bleached or if it's not bleached, that can impact your starter. And so if you're still not getting any kind of bubbles, any kind of activity, then I would just toss that starter and start anew. Even better, if you have a friend who has an established starter, you only need a very small piece to get your own starter going. So see if you can find somebody maybe in your local community who has a strong starter that you can just get a little piece from. Okay, MJ asks, can you show the process or explain what step you do once you're down to your less 10 grams? That's what we just showed. So when you're down to your last little bit of starter, you just feed it with that one part water to 2 parts flour ratio, and that's how you make more. It's no more complicated than that. This is a good one. How do you maintain the motivation to keep your sourdough starter alive? I have killed many sourdough starters in my year of sourdough baking, and it wasn't until I understood this dry starter method that I was able to actually keep a sourdough starter alive. And that's simply because I was making sourdough bread at the same time that I was raising children, and I could barely remember to wash my hair twice a week. So I definitely was not remembering to feed my sourdough starter twice a day. The thing about wet starters is you're wasting a lot of starters. So people are always coming up with recipes to sort of use that toss off. Otherwise, you end up feeding a huge amount and it wastes a lot of flour. And so all of these problems are solved just by using a dry sourdough starter, because like I said, this can stay in the refrigerator for however long it takes you to bake those loaves from it until you're down to your last little bit. I'm sensing a theme here. How often do you feed your starter once it's in the fridge? Once my starter is in the fridge, I do not feed it until it's almost gone. Again, once it's down to that small amount, then I feed it again. But while it's in there, just hanging out, I don't feed it at all. It just stays in the refrigerator for the full time. All right, so that was answering all the starter questions that came through over on our community page. We have a nice healthy starter now. Before this dries out, I'm gonna move mine back into here. Waste not, want not. So now we're going to move on to what is called the leaven, or the levain. I've heard it pronounced, though I'm not quite that fancy. So this is where we're going to essentially start our bread. So when I want to make a loaf of bread, now that my sourdough starter is fed and happy and active, let's say it's Monday morning and I want to have a loaf of bread Tuesday morning. This is where that process begins. I think this is where people get really bogged down in sourdough. But really, you just have to remember to plan ahead. It really doesn't take that much effort. You'll see it's a very passive process. So I want to start making a loaf of bread. I'm going to make my leaven. What that means is I'm going to take some of my starter, I'm going to mix it with warm water and flour. Then I'm going to cover it and let it set aside for about 6 to 10 hours, depending on how warm your kitchen is, what kind of time you have, frankly. Okay, so this is kind of where we essentially take our dry starter. We make it healthy. We make it vibrant. We say, hey, you, wake up. You got stuff to do. You got bread to bake. And we wake it up by feeding it. And what it wants to eat is flour and warm water. It likes it warm and it likes food, just like us. So this is how we're waking it up. Look at that, right on the money, 30 grams. How perfect. So my leaven starts with 30 grams of sourdough starter. And then again, zeroing it out. And to this, I'm going to add 130 grams of water. Oh, not quite enough. Okay, 130 grams of water. That's about a cup of water. So this is my entire input level at this point. I'm just smearing that little 30-gram piece of starter into my leaven, sort of just mushing it around. When you've just pulled it from the refrigerator, it's going to be a little bit more stiff. It's going to be a little bit cold. That's one of the reasons that we add the warm water, because we kind of want to bring it up to room temperature, up to that 70 to 80 degree range that we talked about. So you can see there's little pieces in here, but again, we've got a nice milky color. What we're doing now with this leaven is really just feeding the sourdough starter at a different ratio. So that's the ratio for keeping our starter. This is the ratio for starting a loaf of bread. Everything I bake with sourdough, this is how it starts, whether it's bagels or waffles or pancakes or breads. Every loaf of bread I make starts with this exact ratio. Okay, now zero it out again. So we've got 30 grams of starter, 130 grams of warm water. Now I'm going to add in 120 grams of all-purpose einkorn flour. You can use what flour you like, but I've had much better success with better bread using all-purpose flour. And einkorn's really the only flour that I bake with in my kitchen because of the flavor. I love it so much. It's really hard for me to go back to any other type. But 1 cup of einkorn flour weighs about 120 grams. So we're adding essentially 1 cup of flour and 1 cup of water. And this is really, you'll notice that this is a lot more wet because we're using a different ratio. I normally don't do it actually in these fancy little bowls, but this is what I had on hand. So normally what I do, actually I'll show you this. I love making bread, but I do try to make it as simple as possible, because if it's complicated, then it's one more reason to not do it. And so one of the ways that I keep it as simple as possible is I try to use as few dishes as possible, because I don't want to be cleaning up flour forever and ever. So this is what my leaven looks like. Okay? Kind of like a really, really thick pancake batter, but it looks good. It smells like yogurt. It smells delicious. And this is it. That's the entire process. So all I do now is cover this leaven. Now, if you want to convert a recipe that, let's say, calls for 1 cup of active sourdough starter, this would be your starter that you would pull from. This is not the wet ratio that most of those recipes are referring to, but this is that 1-to-1 ratio. So if you want to convert a recipe using your dry sourdough starter, just take a piece, make your leaven, let it sit out until it's nice and bubbly, and then you can just scoop out a cup of that and use that for that recipe. That was one of the questions we got, was on converting. So this is covered and just set aside 6 to 10 hours. In the summer, this goes a lot faster. So a lot of times, if I want to bake bread in the morning, I'll mix up my leaven the night before, and then I'll mix up my bread in the morning and bake it mid-morning. If I want to make bread at night, I'll mix my leaven up really early in the morning, mix my bread together sometime in the afternoon, and then bake it for dinner. So all you have to do is sort of back think, roughly like 12 hours. But that was literally all the amount of effort that was required. So it's pretty minimal. It just takes a little bit of forethought. I've showed this to you before, but this is my leaven pot. This is my sourdough bread pot. It was made by a local potter here, and his name is Al, and I love it. I've had it for years now. So typically, I'm actually going to do this because we're not going to waste it. When I mix up my leaven, I mix it up right into this pot. And the reason that I use this pot is because it has a lid, so I don't have to mess with any kind of plastic wrap, which I hate keeping in my kitchen. And then it's also big enough to hold my entire loaf of bread. So I can mix my bread, put it right back in here to rise, and then I only have to wash one pot. So if you can find a cool pot like this, it makes your sourdough starter that much easy. So anytime I want to bake bread, I get out my pot, get out my scale, take my sourdough starter, mix up my leaven, set it aside for 6 to 10 hours. All right, let's go back to the questions and make sure that I hit all the leaven questions. One question that I get is, what if your plans change? What if you mix your leaven up in the morning and then something happens and you can't bake bread that night? Do you just have to toss it? No. Your leaven is good for up to 24 hours after you mix it. And so even if you don't come back to it until the next morning, you can still use it. What we're doing is, think of it kind of like a snowball reaction. So we've got our starter, okay, that has our yeast in it. Now we're going to add a little bit more water and a little bit more flour, and now we're gaining momentum, and that yeast is really happy. Now when we go to mix our bread, we're going to be adding more water and more flour, and that yeast gets even happier and happier, and ultimately that's what leavens our bread. That's what gives us our beautiful bubbles in our bread. The leaven's going to be strongest at 6 to 10 hours, but it's still very usable for up to 24 hours after you mix it. If after 24 hours you still can't mix it and you really don't want it to go to waste at all, stick it in your refrigerator, pull it out when you're ready. It will not make as good of a bread, but at least then it's not totally wasted. Usually if I forget a leaven and I don't want to waste it, I'll just use it to make like pancakes or waffles or something like that, where I'm not relying on those bubbles and that leaven to do quite as much as I am with, let's say, a French boule loaf. So it's still possible. Don't toss it. You can find a way to use it, even if it's just feeding it to your chickens or something. Okay. So we've covered starter, we've covered our leaven, and now it's time to move on to our bread. I'm going to clip in some footage here of me making just a very standard loaf of bread to show you how I shape it, to show you how I mix it, and I'll be kind of talking through that with you.
So the first step in my basic bread loaf is to take my leaven that's nice and bubbly and to add 300 or 315 grams of water. After that, I add in 600 grams of an all-purpose Einkorn flour, which is what I'm using here. One of the reasons that I got marble countertops was so I could make bread right on this surface. It just lends itself to bread baking very well. So what I'm doing here is just folding the dough over itself. I'm kind of trying to convince it to come together, to smooth it out, to work out any clumps of flour, to help it to absorb the water, and to start to really develop that gluten. After stretching it the first time, I cover it and let it sit for another 15 minutes and then just repeat the process. Fold it from the top down, then from a side, then from the bottom, and then from the other side. You can see already how much the dough has changed just in these first few folds. Cover it again and let it sit for another 15 minutes. One more time, let's stretch this dough. I know this might seem a little bit fussy, but it really does make a difference in the final loaf if you take the time to do it. You'll notice that the dough is a bit tacky, but I am not adding more flour, just using enough so that I can work it. After this final stretch, I put it back into my proofing bowl and I let it sit there for about 3 to 5 hours or until it's grown by about 30%. Make sure that you cover it nicely so that the top doesn't dry out. If the dough develops a crust, then it can't expand. All right, after the time has passed, I'm going to just gently flour my surface and scrape the dough out. You can still see it's springy. It's not totally flat yet. It hasn't overproofed, and that's what we want. The next step is to start shaping our loaf, and I do this by sort of pushing the dough down into a square of sorts and then folding in all the sides into the middle and pressing down just tight enough that it'll hold together. This is going to create my basic loaf shape. After it's basically shaped, I'm going to flip it over so that the seam is on the bottom, and I'm going to work the loaf by moving my hands around it and pushing down. That's going to create tension on the surface, which is ultimately going to create a better spring in the oven. So just keep going and keep going and keep going. Eventually, you'll feel the dough start to stick to the counter. After it does that, twist it a couple more times and really get a nice tension on the outside. And then the loaf is ready to go into our baton basket to rise while the oven finishes preheating. My Dutch oven has been heated up in a 500-degree oven, so it is very hot, and that's what I'm going to transfer the bread into. You can score the bread however you like. I usually opt for just 3 quick slashes because it's fast and easy. This is about after 45 minutes and it looks perfect. Make sure you let the bread cool before you slice into it.
But right now, I really want to walk through some of your troubleshooting questions that you need help with that you left here over on the page. So one question we got was about the bread rising when it's supposed to, but then when it bakes, it sort of deflates and goes flat. So think of yeast as a balloon, and it will fill. So when yeast eats the flour, it creates CO2, and that's ultimately what gives you your bubbles, okay? But your balloon can only hold so much. Once you fill it with too much, it'll pop, and that bubble is gone forever. So it's really about hitting. You want to bake it when that yeast is just really active and really bubbly, but those balloons haven't popped yet. So if your bread is rising and your starter's doing well, and you bake it and it just goes, it's just overproofed. It just means you waited too long to shape that loaf and to get it into the oven. So Einkorn actually, because it has a lot weaker gluten, this is not true for a high gluten bread flour. Einkorn has a really weak gluten, and so it does not double in size really ever, and most sourdough actually doesn't. So when you're making a bread with a commercial yeast, you have to remember commercial yeast is about 500 times stronger than your sourdough. And so that's why you can just get these really incredible rises from something from a commercial yeast. Sourdough is not going to do that. So you can still get beautiful, amazing loaves from sourdough. But okay, hang with me here. This is kind of complicated, and this is another question that I got. Why doesn't my sourdough taste like sourdough from the store? Most sourdough bread that you see at the store is leavened with commercial yeast. Then a spice is added. A sourdough spice is added to give it a traditional sourdough flavor. That does not mean that it was long fermented, that wild yeast and bacteria was used to leaven the bread. It simply means that a sourdough flavor, however they concoct that, was added to the bread. So it's important that you recognize that. It's really terrible marketing, and it makes it very confusing for people who think, I don't like sourdough bread. Well, usually what they mean is I don't like the sourdough spiced bread at the store. Or they think my sourdough bread doesn't taste sour. I thought I liked sourdough and it doesn't taste like the store bread, but it's not going to. And we'll talk about how to get more of that flavor. But it's just important that you realize that commercial yeast is going to inflate your bread differently. So if your sourdough bread does not look like sourdough bread from the store, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong. It means you're actually using a real sourdough starter. It's not apples to apples because they're going to be using a commercial yeast. It's very rare that you actually find a true sourdough long fermented bread in the store labeled as sourdough. So let's talk about that flavor. One comment said it doesn't have nearly as strong of a sourdough flavor as I like. So when I bake sourdough bread, no one really knows it's sourdough bread. And that disappoints some people, and some people really like that. If you do want a stronger sourdough flavor, after you mix up your bread, package it up, cover it, and stick it in the refrigerator for 24 hours because over time those flavors develop. You just have to do a slower fermentation. Okay, so when it's in the refrigerator, everything slows down in the cold. So it'll still continue to ferment, but it's going to be a lot slower, ultimately creating more flavor. If you don't like the sourdough flavor, you can kind of just prepare it just like I'm showing you in this video, and it does not have a super strong flour flavor at all. So that's kind of one way to manipulate the flavor a little bit on both ends. All right, without question, the most common thing I saw on this thread was, why is my sourdough bread so dense? Let this be an encouragement to you. Dense loaves are very common at the beginning, mostly because we're learning to make a dough, and a lot of us are kind of uncomfortable using a wet dough, and so we continue to add more and more flour. If you stick with the ratios, I'll put a recipe below the video for kind of my everyday sourdough bread with instructions. If you follow those ratios and you don't mess with them, chances are your bread will increase exponentially better just because you have you have the right water to flour ratio. So that's one thing to check in your recipe. So my everyday standard loaf that I use is about 300 to 315 grams of water to 600 grams of flour. Going back to our starter ratio, right? 1 part water to 2 parts flour. So 300 water, 600 flour. And that will take care of a lot of issues. Now, again, this is where it doesn't necessarily get complicated, but if you're going to be incorporating whole grain flours, by weight, whole grain flours weigh more. So you have to use less of them, essentially, to get the same result. So I got asked a question about like some, kind of more obscure grains. That's going to be different completely based on what grain you're using. And the only way to deal with that is just through trial and error in your own kitchen. One of the surefire ways to make sure that your dough is going to rise the way that you want it to is just to make sure your sourdough starter is good and healthy. Feed it, make sure you're using it, get your kitchen going with those wild yeasts, get comfortable, introduce it to your hands. That will help a lot. One other way that we can make sure that our loaves don't turn out dense is to shape them correctly. So I'll make sure to clip in here showing how I shape a loaf. The third way that we can really help our loaves turn out better is to, after we shape them, is to help them to rise correctly. So Einkorn has a very weak gluten. Gluten is what holds it together. It's what gives it its structure. And so we have to help that flour. And that's really true of any flour. You can freeform loaves, but if you give it some support, it can put less effort into just kind of holding itself together. There's kind of two ways to do that. One of them is to use one of these bamboo bread rising baskets. They're called a baton basket, I think. You don't ever wash it. Every time you use it, you just sprinkle it with a little bit of flour, boop, pop your loaf in there, and then when you're ready to bake it, pop it over just like that. I'll make sure to clip in a shot of me doing that. So that's one way, because as the bread rises, it has a shape to hold to. If you don't have one of these, another way that you can shape your loaf to keep it from just going like a pancake is to just use, this is just a standard colander that I have in my kitchen. This is called a linen couche. The dough rather does not stick to it. So every time I use it, you can see it's really floury. It also has a few nibbles by mice. I just do a little flour, pop my loaf in here, cover it up with my linen, and this is where it does its final rising before I pop it into the oven. So those are two ways, is just to kind of help structurally support it before you bake it. A third way is to make sure you cook it in a Dutch oven. So what happens in a Dutch oven, I don't have one here right now. It basically looks like this, but it's ceramic, has a lid on it. You preheat it so it's nice and hot, heats up with your oven. When you put your loaf in there, you put the lid on. That dough has water, and the water is going to evaporate. The water doesn't have anywhere to go. It has to stay in there. And so it creates this steam bath for the dough to basically bake in. And what happens when that steam is in there is you get a really nice spring to your dough and a really nice crust, because it keeps it wet, essentially. It can grow more before that crust hardens. If you just put your dough into your oven without a lid, the outside can cook before the inside has finished rising, essentially giving it no place to go. It can't break through that crust. So cooking it in a Dutch oven is a really nice way to make sure that you get as much spring as possible. Another question I got was on basically how do I know if I'm overproofing my dough? Dough kind of has a way of telling you. It should feel nice and tight. Again, at the ratios that I gave you, it should feel tight. When you poke it, it should bounce back. It should have some spring to it. And just kind of remember, don't expect it to double. I think when you make, let's say, cinnamon rolls with a commercial yeast, you're used to it just going poof, and it explodes, and you're like, oh, I'm amazing, this is so great. This is not going to do that. So kind of just watch for about a 30% rise, poke it. It should feel tight still. It should feel springy still. If it gets kind of gooey and sort of starts to lose its form, that usually means that it's overproofed. Why does my bread burn on the bottom? I've tried all different kinds of things, putting a pan in, putting parchment paper in. Raise your tray up. It's just simply sitting too close to that bottom. A lot of times the elements are at the bottom, depending on what kind of oven you have. If it's sitting too close, frankly, the bottom will just burn before the top is able to cook. If you're not able to raise it up anymore, then just turn your oven down a little bit so that you don't get that crust on the bottom. Assuming kind of our density things go in our favor and we're dealing with these things like we've talked about here, one other major problem that I see people doing with their sourdough bread is just underbaking it. And this is why it kind of gets gummy in the middle. That can also be from just using whole grains, which just do not give you the same type of bread that a white flour does. It's just the way that it goes because we're bringing in all other kind of elements with a whole grain, which you can absolutely do well. But underbaking seems to be the number one thing that I see people do. They take the dough out too early. Then they cut into it when it's still hot. And the result of that will just be a gummy loaf of bread. Even when you pull it out of the oven, it still maintains its heat for a very long time. And it needs that time to finish, to dry up accordingly. One of the ways that you can kind of test this is, let's say you think your loaf is done. You pull it out, take the Dutch oven lid off, pop it out. It should actually feel fairly light to you. If it feels really heavy, that means a lot of water is still in there and it needs to evaporate it out. So put it back in. I always tell people err on the side of overbaking rather than underbaking. Of course, there's always the trick of tapping it on the bottom to see if it's hollow. I have not found this to be as effective as just holding the loaf in my hands and knowing what it should feel like. And this just comes down to practice. So be patient with yourself as you're learning how to do these things. You're going to make bad loaves. I still make bad loaves when I'm rushing it, when I'm not paying attention. It happens. That doesn't mean we give up. It just means we keep showing up and learning new things and ultimately getting it to a place that's workable in our own kitchens. All right, last question I got on bread is how do I keep it deflating when I score it? Scoring is when you cut the top of it, giving the gas somewhere to go as the bread rises. If it's deflating when you're scoring it, it means it's overproofed. You should get a nice cut and it should feel tight and springy. Get those cuts, put it into the oven, and they should then kind of explode from there. So if you're cutting it and it's just going, that just means it's way too overproofed for the most part. Okay, I think that was everyone's questions. I hope that this was helpful for you. I never, ever get tired of talking about sourdough starters or bread at all. So if you have any questions, tag them below, and then we can do another video showcasing those questions so that you ultimately can feel better in your kitchen making this bread. I hope you guys get to it. I hope that it doesn't intimidate you. Again, know you're not alone. Plenty of us have made very bad bread, but there's also good bread to be had. So I hope that this encourages you to get in there and to get baking. Good luck.